No, I just want to invite members of our audience if anyone's got questions or thoughts. Yes.
I'm thinking about the possible different meanings of the words that you introduce in the construction that you can use. For example, utopia, the future, dystopia as well, apocalypse, apocalyptic portrayals in literature, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that comes to mind is to perhaps understand utopia somehow parallel to the notion of the future, partly to come, partly already in the present, and so on, to play with it. And along with it, I'm also thinking back in the past as you are tracking us through your narrative, and trying to think about the subtext of the narrative, because the campfire probably more or less hasn't changed, but the language has. So I'm thinking about the subtext of that narrative back then by the campfire, and I'm trying to imagine it, and I don't think I can, so I'm asking you to somehow help us with that.
Well, the language problems for this book were pretty severe. I had to make some decisions, and one of them that I decided was that I think that we were fully linguistic by, say, 60, 70, 80,000 years ago, maybe 100,000 years ago. This is contested. When did we get language, and was it a quick acquisition from the idea of language to full language, or was there a period where we were speaking primitiver languages, pigeons of one kind or another, working up to full language? None of that is at all obvious. So, but what I was speculating, and I think, and once again, I think I'm right, that 32,000 years ago, they had a full language, some kind of Proto-Indo-European. And recently they published an article that these 100 oldest words that they've worked out that are older than Proto-Indo-European and perhaps 15,000 years old, that words that included mama. And because I have characters in this book saying mamma mia often, and getting a lot of crap for that, why does this book break into mamma mia? And it turns out that both of those words are probably amongst the oldest words that we have, and it's kind of great, because I was making a joke that in any language there are going to be phrases from foreign languages that you use. And this is a Mother Earth religion, and so Mamma Mia makes perfect sense to me, and it was a joke. But now it turns out it might even have been right. So, I mean, it might have been insane 32,000 years ago. And I looked, because of the internet being what it is, I took a lot of terms out of Basque, because it seems like the Basque language is immensely ancient. And then I took words that historical linguists intuited, had worked up. Proto-Indo-European is another language I would put into the Google translating dictionary and get words out of Proto-Indo-European. It's quite amazing what you can get now on the internet. So I played those games. For one thing, I couldn't use any sexual terms or bodily parts that weren't weirdly weighted by English. And so, and Latin isn't any better, because that's another way that English has tried to get around that problem. So I ended up using Basque terms, because the book is filled with these words, and I didn't want the book to be distorted by the experience of reading these words that have a lot of baggage from our Judeo-Christian attitudes towards our bodies. In my case, a kind of Puritan attitude towards the body that I didn't want these people to have. So I had to play language games like that.
And you did, I'm sorry, you did include some of the Proto-Indo-European language words.
I did, yeah, and Basque.
Oh.
For essentially for genitals and other sexual terms that in English have an emotional weight, like a moralistic weight one way or another. They're curses, or they're trying to beat around the bush. They're one way or another. They aren't quite what I thought people would be using them. The language games were. It was an intense struggle for me. I also like the word fact. These people did not have the word fact. A fact is a Bruno Latour thing. It's a black box. It's not. They might have talked about the truth. They might have talked about what was real and what wasn't real, but they wouldn't be talking about the facts, because facts are constructs out of modernity. Well, at that point, you really have to begin to look at every word and think about the OED, and think about when was it introduced and what was it for, and would they have. So one time I was reading this book aloud to an audience, and they talked about being in an envelope of morons. In my mind, while I was reading, I was totally distracted. envelope in 32,000 BC? What could that mean? And so I have, in the paperback, I'm changing it to sheath, in a sheath, because it seems to me they had sheaths, but they didn't have envelopes. And so it goes on like that. And as for utopia, dystopia, these are modern terms that are a different dynamic entirely. And here they might talk about the good place, like the land of cocaine in medieval times, but not utopia, dystopia.
And this, to me, it does succeed in the estrangement of language, because I keep looking at it, thinking, and I might agree or disagree with the choices you made at any particular point, but the fact that you've chosen is making me think about how language would function historically in its time, that sort of thing. It really works quite nicely. But if you're going to write about sex, wouldn't we all rather write French? It's so much more, it's not euphemistic, it's so much simpler. So if it's translated, it'd be interesting to see how they solve that problem.
But
they go to your vast roots.
I hope, like anything, there's a French edition of this book, given that it's set in France.
Exactly.
I have a theory about dystopia, by the way. The reason that we have so much dystopian literature now is not just that things feel grim right now, but that also satire doesn't work anymore. Because satire is really the basis of utopia, dystopia, and satire, of course, is very ancient. And so for thousands of years we've been doing satire as a kind of this needle that you stick into people, saying, you should be ashamed, we could do so much better, and making fun of our stupidity. But it hasn't worked for 2,000 years, for 3,000 years. I mean, it's stupider and stupider. And this is a culture that's like beyond satire. If you're trying to satirize the current moment in America, how could you be more ridiculous than we already are? And besides which, we've never managed to shame ourselves into better behavior. That's when you get dystopia. And you say, oh, it's just going to be bad, and it isn't funny anymore. And that's why we have dystopias instead of satire.
I keep getting sent those memes about what crazy Republicans did this week. And of course, half the time they're not real, but you can't tell the difference. And it's why the other guy's exempt from this anyway, because it all seems crazy. Yeah, so that's interesting. Just to think about. Any other ideas? I'll go here and then there and then here.
When I first heard about this project compared to your other books, I thought, oh wow, this is the Dylan Goes Electric moment, and you're going to be some people yelling to the stage.
Yeah.
Especially from the Darko Suvin definition, since he's come up a few times, because isn't his thing, it's not just estrangement, there has to be a novum, right? It's been a long, long time since I read it. That's right. So maybe, I also loved how he called regular fiction, whatever you want to call it, mundane literature, because it was set on the earth. So this would be, is this your mundane book? Was there a novum? Or, I mean, that's one.
Well, I still think it's science fiction because it takes the sciences to know what they were up to at all. And also, I happen to know, Suvin and I are in correspondence, and he's retired in Italy, and writing like the most incredible history of Yugoslavia that you'll ever want to read. It's beautiful. But he's told me he's a huge fan of prehistoric literature. So I don't think he thinks that this is fantasy.
It made me think of the iconic jump cut in 2001. So you're always going to have the bone and then the...
Yeah, it's nice to go back to the bone. You have to explain that bone moment.
Yeah. But my real question, I guess, is more about academic speculative realism, and you're being kind of you're being newly approached as a kind of godfather of a certain humanities meets science. I'm thinking particularly of the phrase ecology without nature, Timothy Morton's book, which is a very thought-provoking phrase. But I wonder if you are sitting here watching, journals and graduate students and things coming up to you for more and more interviews, as someone who was there before, through this genre. Were you sort of waiting for us to catch up, or what was the situation there? Because you've been writing about ecology without nature from the early 90s, and the humanities, the professors, the philosophers, these other folks seem to be just tweaking onto it now. And in a critical mass version, of course, there's always exceptions of people.
Element of comrade, we're always
Well, I think a little of this is a stance that people have taken in the science fiction field to insist on being outside of art. And it's very desirable to be outside of art when inside of art is seen as weak and craven and as subject to university control. So I fully buy into that stance. I like being thought of as an outsider art and being essentially disregarded by various mainstream literary establishment organizations. But academia has never really been part of that. And at least not in my own personal history, because my introduction to science fiction was Frederick Jameson telling me to go read Philip K. Dick, the greatest living American writer, Jameson said. And that was a startling thought for me. But I've always had huge support from my connections in academia. My teachers have been great, and ever since then it's been good. And I think actually when Jameson published Archaeologies of the Future, in maybe 2005, that this for him was somewhat coming out of the closet as a science fiction fan. Because his articles had been published in SF Studies and in other obscure places that had never had a book. A lot of people who had read Jameson and thought that he was the most influential, one of the most influential critics in the world of our time, had no idea that he was a science fiction fan until he published his book. And there he's speaking about Cordwainer Smith and Edgar Pangborn and all that Stapleton, as if everybody really ought to know them if they were an educated person. And so that, I think, changed the game. And I call them sons of Fred, although it's really sons and daughters of Fred, because there's a lot of women students he had, and a lot of students in China and Brazil. He's an international figure. And they are all now much more interested in science fiction than they were before, and there's been a kind of a renaissance of science fiction studies. And I think that this may be my own perspective, because I'm one of his students, but for me, he's been a crucial figure.
We need to supplement Gibson's typewriter with Jameson's.
You have talked about the differences between different genres, for example, fiction, science fiction or fantasy, but for you, what is the main difference between literary fiction and science fiction? And mostly, what are the differences between your characters and the characters of literary novels?
That's a good question. I think that literary fiction is to a certain extent a publishing category. It's true for all these genres. They're genres, but they're also publishing categories, and the two are very tightly intertwined. So literary fiction, if you take that timeline and you say science fiction is the histories we can't know, literary fiction is the history that we can know going back about 50 to 100 years from the present. If you go earlier than that, you've got historical fiction. And up until recently, historical fiction could never be literary fiction. It was another sub-perfect genre. In high modernism, a historical novel was just as dumb as a science fiction novel or a mystery. The genres were low, literary fiction was high. This was modernism's high-low split. It was all was false, but it was very powerful. So literary fiction was the good stuff, by definition. Everything else was the bad stuff. And I still deal with that problem a lot. But also literary fiction in our time is about, I say the novel is about individual characters in relationship to their society. And you need both. You need the social and you need the individual to make a novel good. And there you have, this is Lukács, right? This is Balzac, this is Tolstoy, this is the 19th century novel. It's not just individual characters and whether they're going to get divorced or whether they're going to get back together again. And so literary fiction in our time is a post-high modernist, imitative, exhausted, no new stories to tell, ridiculously inconsequential and trivial stuff about bourgeois American culture. So, and they keep doing it over and over again. So that the best novel of 2013 in literary fiction is going to be exactly as good and bad and about the same stuff as the best literary fiction novel of 1985. And so this is you can see this is a bit of a rant coming from the point of view of one of the previously despised genres. And so what you can say, though, is I can pick texts for you from the science fiction world that are as well written as literary fiction, and in which the characters are as three-dimensional, to use Forster's term, as any literary fiction. You have to go to writers like Jeff Ryman or Glenn Jones or M. John Harrison, and you go to the truly fine stylists in science fiction and you find language as good as anything else, but they're often very obscure in the mainstream culture. I also think it's very significant that Hilary Mantel, with her novels about Henry VIII, Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies, both winning the Booker Prize, a sequel winning the Booker Prize, after the first book won the Booker Prize, well, that has never happened and it will never happen again, because it's too weird. the worker price dynamics, worker price politics is almost impossible. But what I think has become clear is that novel, which is a trilogy, it will be one novel in the end, is one of the best English novels of the last 10 or 20 or 50 years, one of the great English novels. And that Hilary Mantel is now the greatest English novelist, and better than these literary fiction guys, the Wyman guys I call them, because they whine so much. Martin Amis, Will Self, I have to God, I'm on film. But there's a sense in which Hilary Mantel has blown open the sense of what's fine art in the novel, because she's done such a superb historical novel.
It's like you need to do the reverse and say that, Ian McEwan's Solar is really bad science fiction.
Right.
I mean, it's supposedly about, climate change and stuff, but it's really about a guy and his penis. Again, we can do better.
Yeah.
On several fronts like that. I had another question over on this side.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could say a couple words about the effect of sort of the variety of disasters caused by climate change that happened in the real world while you were writing Science in the Capital trilogy.
Well, there is an interesting story to tell there, in that in Science in the Capital trilogy, I have a massive flood flooding Washington, D.C. So for about a week, most of Washington, D.C., well, no, I shouldn't say most, but a significant portion of Washington, D.C., and especially the mall, where the Washington Monument is only 10 feet above sea level. And on the Potomac, and the Potomac is a gigantic watershed. So it was very plausible to flood Washington, D.C. And I used to read that passage around to create applause from the audience. The idea of flooding Washington, D.C. is popular on every side of the island. But then Katrina happened in the midst of me writing the second volume, and I had drowned one of the Sundarbans in a catastrophe type style, and many of the Sundarbans are now going under. This is in the mouth of the Ganges. So some things were happening like right after I wrote them. And I could never read the flooding in Washington, D.C. scene again after Katrina, because it wasn't funny anymore. And people even attacked me with how I had written up the flooding of Washington, D.C. as a kind of a celebratory moment where it was a festival scene. And then Katrina was such an obvious trauma and disaster. And I had a couple of technical excuses. Washington, D.C. was a freshwater flood that lasted 3 days that I made up. And Katrina was a saltwater flood that lasted about 6 months. And the U.S. government built prisons faster than they got relief people in. So that the response to Katrina, because it was in the South, was to build prisons with the expectation that there was going to be looting and rioting and it was going to be a human disaster, which turned out to be completely untrue. And the U.S. government response created a worse problem than existed before, which was really not what disaster relief was supposed to be about. So, that's a very dystopian reaction. I would hesitate to write that up in advance because it would be so cynical and dark. It's just not my style. And yet it's what really happened. So, I don't know. The other thing I postulated in those books were the stalling of the Gulf Stream, at which point you get that movie The Day After, where New York is iced over. It's not quite that bad, but if the Gulf Stream were to stall, winters here would be like the Yukon Territory. So that's why my middle volume is called 50 Degrees Below, and then it takes place in Washington, D.C., there's a cold day in the winter and it goes to 50 below. And that could happen. But now they say the Gulf Stream isn't anywhere near as likely to stall as they were saying back when I wrote the book. So it becomes one of those science fiction stories that you tell, and then science later on makes a correction, and your story goes off into a space that isn't as realistic as you thought. And I don't feel too bad about that, because weird weather is going to happen. And so you can say, since there's going to be weird weather, it's not a matter of picking the right weird weather. It's just saying, let's push right weird weather and how much it's going to hammer our civilization.
You could even say that science fiction as a genre is actually cumulative knowledge, in the sense that the later it's written, usually there's better science. And it's kind of interesting to look back and go, really? You thought that was possible?
You can see that with the stories of Mars. First you get the Percival Lowell moment where Mars has a civilization and there are canals and there are intelligent beings there. Then they begin to see that there's no water or oxygen, and then you get the dry Mars stories in the 1940s, like Bradbury and Clark. And then you get the desiccated Mars of Philip K. Dick and D.G. Humphrey. And then you get what I've got is that there actually is a ton of water on Mars. I mean, very lot of water, so you can come back to terraforming. So the history of Mars novels follows the sciences, and that happens a lot.
Now, I think I had another question around the side somewhere.
I sort of have a question. In the passage that you read to us, you mentioned walking for a fortnight, walking 17 years, had notions of forever even. And I was just wondering, as part of your process as a writer, what do you do to get into this long-form mental space in our contemporary time?
The space of the novel, or of Long Walk, or of Both Alzheimer's? Or
Well, the novel as a long form itself, but also intertextually in the subject matter you're writing about.
Yeah. Well, I have to say that one of the reasons that I wanted so much to write this book is that I spend all the time that I can in the High Sierra of California. So between Mount Whitney and Yosemite is a high granite plateau that is only lightly edged by glaciation, although it is edged, so that you can do long hikes, the John Muir Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, but also getting off the trail, you can still make your way across a granite landscape that is particularly magnificent and good for walking. So I've taken some long walks, and I reckon that recently, for my own purposes, calculated I've probably walked about 3,000 miles in my Sierra life, which is now about 4 years of walking. And there are people who walk 3,000 miles in one summer as part of the extreme walking movement nowadays, and that's why the backpacking is so light, because for these people, every ounce counts. So that's a movement that is way beyond what I do, but I spent a lot of time up there, including snow camping, which was crucial for this book. Because when they make their snowshoe treks in this book, there were things that I knew from my own body, from my own falls, from my own accidents, from my own bad knee, what it would be like to be on snowshoes and trying to get around, even in storms, Sierra storms are relatively benign in that they are not super cold. They can kill you, but you would have to be very bad to get killed by a Sierra storm. By and large, you can get out of them by just going on. So I had things that I knew that I could write about. And that was a huge help because, many books, it's just the way life is, especially for a science fiction writer. Books come out of previous books, and you see that in high fantasy in particular, the Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox. You think, how many times does this get back to Tolkien, much less, the Grundle poem or the early epics? They haven't even gone back that far. They've only read Tolkien, or maybe they've only read Terry Brooks, or maybe they've only read David Eddings, or maybe they've only read The Thing That Came Out Last Year, or maybe they've only just seen the Lord of the Rings movies. Well, these writers write, but they don't know what they're talking about. And they're writing out of books. And some of them are awfully good at imagining it, because I think we've got some unconscious memories from our deep past, and I just think people are very good at that. Writing a plausible sentence is not a matter of you had to go out to do it. I would not make that claim. And this is the claim that would kill people like Kerouac, that would kill people like Hemingway, who thought they had to do it before they could authentically write about it. And then write a book that would eat up 5 years of their life, and they'd go out drunk and do something else stupid so that they could write the next book.
Just an excuse.
But it was also a working method. Kerouac could not write unless he'd done it. Hemingway could not write unless he'd done it, and feel right about themselves. I don't think that's right. I've made up many a thing that I know nothing about and just tried to make the sentences plausible and make it ring true. But one thing I did know was hiking in snow, and I think that does help. Because then I've got some new observations. What does snow look like? Actually, when you're exhausted in snow, or when you've got that aerobic moment where your heart is beating like 120, 130 beats a minute because you're going uphill in snow with snowshoes, why does the snow turn black? Well, do people know that the snow actually turns black? And yet it does. And so that was something I could write down that I never read that anywhere else because it actually happens rather than me having read about it. So then I can share the news, because then it's news.
Well, it certainly works as a non-Sierra hiker.
Good.
I sort of find I'm learning things about the world that I don't have had to experience of. With another thought, yeah.
Hey, I have only started the 2312 book, and so I'm really just a little bit of a ways in, but when you were just talking about the hiking, I immediately telegraphed into the beginning where you have people who are walking on the surface of Mercury and they're calibrating how far they are in advance of the sun resting over the landscape. And you write really beautifully about that, like the experience that might be, and the kind of emotional, intellectual, desire-driven, curiosity-driven, to use a term I think Ken brought up, motivations that would bring someone to just walk on the surface of Mercury in advance of the sun rising for maybe days, or maybe 19 years, I don't know, maybe a long time.
A way of life.
And so that's really compelling, and for a weird reason that I can't explain, I was thinking of a film a couple of times when you were talking, and Enter the Void. And the reason I was thinking that, have you seen this film? Maybe I'll summarize it really quickly so that part of the film is about a transmigration of the soul, and a very long portion of the film is shot from the point of view of ostensibly a soul that has transmigrated, that's wandering around Tokyo, looking for people maybe it used to know, maybe looking for a new body to manifest in. And the way that the filmmakers render this wandering is both totally grounded in the human, but it's also just compellingly outside the human. It's really remarkable. And I was also thinking of a term that Ben Bratton, who I know you know, has been thinking about a lot, which is this idea of evacuating the human diagram, or going beyond the human diagram, or thinking ethics in past post-human relations outside the human diagram. And so for me, the direct image encounter in Enter the Void is a really powerful partial vision of what that might be, and the kind of not really human anymore pastime of walking in front of that rising sun on the surface of Mercury is also a little bit part of that. And so this is a really long preamble to ask the question, what do you think we will be when we go beyond the human diagram? Because the 2-foot-tall human and the 10-foot-tall human, they still have a lot of that diagram left over. But I'm wondering what you think.
Well, that's a good question, and Bratton is very good on this visual art, what some people call it post-human, but I don't think that's a good term because we'll still be human. What I'd like to say is that we will always still be these people, the primates that were in the Paleolithic. We'll always, with this DNA, remain fundamentally Paleolithic. But then there's the technological sublime. And the technological sublime starts when you can wear clothing and go up into places where it's 50 degrees below and you're still alive. Whoa, it's a great moment. And then on Mercury, this is one of the great jokes, is that Mercury rotates at such a speed that even on the equator itself, you only have to walk 5 miles an hour and you stay right with the sunrise. And if you're closer to the pole, you can go even slower. So I thought our nomadic past, because we're still Paleolithic and we like walking, we like endurance walks, and people are doing the Pacific Crest Trail and the Appalachian Trail, that once you could do it, you would do it because it would be so beautiful with the sunrise occasionally. Even a little bit of the sun on Mercury is too much. But you could see it and then start hauling ass for the shadow in the Terminator. And the shadows would be bouncy. It's about a 30-kilometer zone, where in some places, when the sun rises up over a hill, it shoots 30 kilometers. And you have to know that, because you can't walk 30 kilometers in the time that it would take to be a cook. So then they have to structure the walks. So the technological sublime, I think, is the best way to think about this space that we're coming into, this different human diagram. That we're still human, it's not post-humanity, but what you've got is an increasing technological sublime. Yesterday I flew into LaGuardia, sitting in the left side window, and you talk about the technological sublime. First of all, there's just Manhattan itself as an object, an art object. But then secondly, they could be coming in at 5,000 feet in the late afternoon when the sun's coming across it and looking at the whole thing. That is the technological sublime to the max. Somebody should have been playing Beethoven's Awakening. You need to render these moments and understand that you're in an art moment. It would be fantastic.
There are many wonderful new kinds of fun in your novels.
It's true. It's very true. I like the feature of fun.
There's rings around Saturn, so why can't you surf then?
Every wave will be surfed. That's right. We'll get to that in 2312. There's a lot of long walks in my books, and there's a lot of surfing in my books, and games in general.
Now, are there any other questions people have in the audience? I think I want to leave Stan some time to sign in books. Anybody might want to put purchase today, or to have a private word, we might be done at that point. Yeah? Last thoughts?
Thank you, I really appreciate it, it's been fun. And yeah, I'll stick around here and chat if you'd like. It'd be fun.
Yeah, and there's snacks and coffee if anybody feels the need right at the back there. Thank you, Stan.
Thank you.